Hello, and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. Today's podcast number 2248. The topic is Q&A, and the title is Training to Failure versus Leaving a Few Reps in the Tank. One of my clients is a personal trainer for powerlifting. He's gotten into powerlifting coaching and absolutely loves it. He recently sent in the following question on his journal. He said, Rob, I wanted your opinion on this if you don't mind. I have a client. He's strong AF. I'll let you figure out what that means, but he's very strong. He's strong for reps, but when we get to 1 rep maxes, he fails miserably, but not strength-wise, mental-wise. He did a set of 425 for 6 last month. This current program, I peaked him at 455 for 1, but he couldn't do it. So again, just a real quick recap, 425 pounds for 6 reps. And then they just added 30 pounds, less than 10%, and he couldn't even do it for a single. He then continued and said, am I wrong to expect that if he did 425 for 6, that he should be able to do 455 for 1? I don't think I am. But when he gets under the bar, he forgets everything. I know people say you shouldn't fail reps in training, but do you think it'd be helpful for him to lift heavier maxes more often so he can get over his mental issues with heavy weight? Yes. So this specific situation, yes, I do think lifting heavier more often would be helpful. I would do it in like a wave approach. So if we're looking at, let's say the person failed 455, we know they're comfortable at 425. Let's bridge the gap a little bit. So we might do 435 for multiple sets of singles. And then next week, 440 for singles. Next week, 445 for singles. The following week, 450 for singles. Then maybe we start a new program, new accessories. We go back down to 440 for singles, then 445 for singles, 450 for singles. And then week 4 of the second program, he goes back to 455 and can hit it for a single. Now, this is incredibly cautious. Like to do a wave approach to go up 30 pounds across 8 weeks, it's incredibly cautious. You could certainly do this in many different ways, more aggressive ways. But this would be an example of a way that is very mentally friendly, and it would give multiple attempts at that heavy weight load. So for example, if they can do 425 for a set of 6, and then we just try 435 for a single, they might be able to do 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe even 8 singles, really depending on the technique proficiency, like how close is that person's technique ability to their actual strength capacity. Meaning the closer someone's technique is to being perfect, the less top-end singles they can do, because it just exerts more out of them to do them. But the less technique proficient someone is, the more top singles they can do, because their technique max isn't as close to their actual physical max. So the top max technique-wise doesn't take away as much from them. So a summary of that is the better someone's technique, the less top-end singles they should do, just because it takes more out of them to do them. Now, for this, again, that like the wave approach and just doing 435, then 440, 445, 450, and then starting back down at 440, then 445, then 450, then 455. Again, ridiculously cautious. But this would be something that the trainer can introduce what they're going to do to that client, and it gives them a chance to be at 435 plus for 8 weeks in a row. Now, he was having him peak before where he would do like 385 and 405 and 425, and then all of a sudden he randomly tried a 455. So he's been below 435 almost all the time. So they're only jumping up to this like plus 425 randomly once in a while. So the idea of this ladder or this wave approach is it incredibly cautious? Absolutely, yes, I understand that. But it still has major benefits because it's cautious enough that the person doesn't hurry up and put on mental defenses and think, oh my gosh, this is too heavy, too quick. But it's also heavy enough, if you think of the frequency in which you're going to be at this high of a percentage, that it's going to create a physical demand increase. And that's really what we want. Then I would also add walkout holds either before or after the top end sets. So you might have them just unrack, 455 and stand there for 10 seconds and put it back in the rack, and then do their working sets at 430. As they get comfortable with unracking and racking 455, maybe you try 465, then 475, then 485. You can easily do like a stand up out of the rack, stand there, and then just put it back in the rack. I mean, gosh, you could go up to 120%, 130% of your 1 rep max if you wanted to. If you do actual walkouts where you unrack, take your steps back as if you're unracking it and getting ready to squat, you just stand there for a little bit, then you walk back in. When you do walkouts and walk-ins, you maybe can move up to like maybe 110. Some people have done a little higher than that percentage of 1 rep max. But that, again, is something you can do every single week that gets them under at least 455 every single week. And then 8 weeks in a row, you're getting over that like 90% threshold for multiple singles. You're now getting them much more accustomed to heavy weights. And then before their squats, like in their pre-squat routine, along with movement prep and stretching and dynamic movements and whatnot, you might have them do yoke carries. You might have them do farmer carries with like farmer's implements or a trap bar. You just basically want to make them pick up and move around heavy stuff. The idea is if you put the athlete under heavier weight loads more often, then heavy weight loads become less mentally scary, right? So it makes sense. I mean, if we want to grow the muscles, we put them under progressively heavier loads over time. If we want to grow the mind and how it manages heavy weight loads, we want to put it under heavier weight loads more progressively more over time. Same exact concept. To grow the muscles is to grow the mind. You want to do it in safe ways that don't cause injuries, but you do want to do it in progressively overloading ways. In general, when we think about training to failure versus leaving a few reps in the tank, I would really like to redefine what training to failure means. There is a huge difference in how I encourage athletes to train to failure versus what people may perceive the term training to failure means. And that difference is that we want to train to the edge of failure. So you're training to failure. I want to walk to the edge. So if you're looking off of a cliff, when somebody says, "Oh, walk to the edge of the cliff," like you want to walk to the cliff. Like you're walking to it, not off of it or into it. So if you want to walk up to something, like, can you walk over to the car? Can you walk over to the door? Can you walk over to this? They don't mean walk into it. So if it's like, hey, can you go over to the door and check that scratch? You're not going to walk and smack your face off the door. You're going to stop in front of the door and look at the scratch. So when we say train to failure, what that means is you're training to failure, not into failure. So you're training to the edge of failure, not into failure. When people say you shouldn't train to failure, that advice means you shouldn't train into failure. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't train to the edge of failure. Training to the edge of failure has enormous benefits, absolutely enormous benefits. Does it have risks? Absolutely. But enormous benefits. The main thing, and I'm going to go through a lot more details here in a second, but the main thing is if you never train to the edge of failure, my belief is that you're never really going to find out where failure is. You're always going to be much shorter than you think you are of failure, and you're going to limit long-term progressive growth. This is often why beginners struggle to become intermediates, and absolutely why intermediates struggle to become elite in whatever the sport is. And that is because if they are on the cautious side, if they train on the cautious side to failure, they're often not getting close enough to failure to really drive neurological and physiological development that the body, that stress demand that the body needs to really make those progressive changes. They're always training where they're like, maybe I could have done 1 or 2 more reps, when in reality they could have done 5 or 6 or 7. Now, the other end of it is when people say like if you told somebody, I want you to do, an RPE. So An RPE is rate of perceived exertion, and this can be used in bodybuilding, but it's most commonly used in bodybuilding. I mean aesthetic sports. Anybody trying to grow muscle, whether you're a bodybuilder, physique athlete, classic physique, bikini, wellness, figure, all the categories. But if you get on a bodybuilding stage, there you go. You're an aesthetic athlete. Aesthetic athletes can use RPEs for sure, but RPE is most commonly used in strength athletes. Again, it's rate of perceived exertion. The scale range that we typically use in programming is 5 to 10. 5 is you're moving and you're doing something. So 1 would be is you're laying in bed. So if you're in the gym, you're not at a 1. You're at least at a 5 because you're standing. You're doing something after the gym. 5 is you're moving, but there's no stress at all. 6 is a little bit of an increase above that. 7 is I'm moving, things are starting to burn a little bit, but technique is fine, I'm okay, I can just feel that this is getting uncomfortable. 8 is, okay, this is definitely uncomfortable, but at no point in time do I feel like I'm going to lose my technique quality. 9 is this is really, really uncomfortable. I believe I can do this correctly, but my technique is starting to waver. My technique is starting to break down a little bit. I'm starting to feel as though maybe these reps aren't as clean as I might like them to be. 10 is all out effort, the best you can give. So our goal with RPE is to kind of recommend to the athlete, the client, and say, hey, this is how hard I want you to push on things. When people mistake training to failure, meaning going like into it, they're training at a 10 all the time. So they're like, well, you want me to do a set of 5, so I put on all this weight. The third one looked kind of crappy. The fourth looked like absolute shit. The fifth one, I damn near died. Somehow I didn't get hurt. And they're like, well, I think that was to failure. And I'm like, no, that was into and through failure. We didn't want to go into it, and we damn sure don't want to go through it. So we don't want to get to the end of failure. So if you think about the word, if you're like a visual person and you think about spelling it Failure, we don't want to go to the E. We want to go to the F. You're going to go right to the edge of it, the front edge of it. You're not trying to go through it to the damn E. So when we say train to failure, it means you want to train to the edge of failure, not into failure. So in general, it is recommended, as this client alluded to, it's recommended that people avoid training to failure in regular training. And you'll hear this like Ed Cohen, like the GOAT of powerlifting. You'll hear him and other people recommend that you shouldn't fail reps in training. And what they're saying is you shouldn't train into failure. But do you train to the edge of it where you're like, holy shit, I can't believe I got that. I barely got that, but I got it. Of course, they're going to do that all the time. That's going to be the majority of your top end weight, is you're training to the edge of failure, not into failure. So when you hear the advice, don't train to failure, that means don't train into failure. Training to the edge allows you to extend the edge. That allows you to create room and space for growth. That is how we grow both physically and, in this client's case, mentally. His client needs mental growth. How we're going to grow mentally is we have to push the boundaries. We have to push where our mental edge is to create space for us to grow into a bigger and expanded boundary. So training to failure means training to the edge of failure. And that is super beneficial. So strength athletes do need to push the edge of failure, and they need to push it much more often than aesthetic athletes. So aesthetic athletes, they want to create progression from week to week to drive training volume and mechanical tension, neurological load, I don't even know if that's a term, but basically the idea is that aesthetic athletes, they do need to progressively overload their tissues. That would be a safe way of saying it. You can get rid of all the fancy words. They just need to progressively overload their body. Now, what that might mean is when they're trying a new movement or it's the beginning of a program, they might train, quote unquote, a few reps short, leave a few reps in the tank. So maybe they stop at 10 reps when they really probably could have done, in their mind, they're like, I probably could have done definitely at 11th, maybe even at 12th, but they'll stop at 10. Well, the second week of a program, you got to make some kind of progression. So maybe now instead of stopping at 10, they try to drive to 11. The third week of a program, again, there's got to be some kind of progression. Maybe they can drop back to 10 but go up 5 pounds. Then the fourth week of a program, maybe they can keep that new weight, drive to 11 again. Maybe the following week, they're not really sure if they can go up in weight, so maybe they get a set of 12. The goal is they're moving up in weight or reps somehow every time they repeat that movement. Now that can lead to them sacrificing good technique in order to make that progression, and that can lead to injury. So we don't want to do that. They don't want to train into failure, meaning technique like breakdown, because it absolutely can lead to injury. And it's more likely to actually cause an injury training into failure for aesthetic athletes because they have a better way to control where their edge is. So by the time they push into it, they are really into it. Now, the fun and nuance of this is it's easier in a sense for an aesthetic athlete to know where the edge is because they move with a slower tempo and they are taught to have mind-muscle connection, meaning they should be paying attention to exactly how the muscle feels that they're targeting with their movement. Now, what this means is a slower tempo and having a mind-muscle connection. It allows them to better feel small technique variances. So when their technique breaks down even just a smidge, they're going to be more aware of it. Now, because they're more aware of it, they need to stop and be careful. Now, this keeps them safer usually long term if they honor that and they actually follow that. But it does slow down like the rate of strength progression compared to explosive athletes or strength-based athletes. But that's okay because aesthetic athletes aren't strength-focused. They do need to increase strength over time, and that helps increase like overall workload capacity and like how much they actually do, so overall workload volume. And then it also increases the mechanical tension that they create in their movements, and that allows for muscle growth. So aesthetic athletes do need to get stronger, but they can afford to get stronger slower, at a slower rate. Whereas with strength athletes, the whole freaking goal is how strong you are. So you're trying to get as strong as you can, as fast as you can, right? Now, the difference is they do not move with a slow tempo. They move the damn thing as fast as they can. And they're not mind-muscle focused, they're mind-movement focused. Meaning they're not paying attention to what individual specific muscles are doing. They're more so paying attention to their position. So they are position focused, not muscle focused. Am I in the right position throughout the entire movement to be as efficient in this movement as possible? Because they move faster, because they're more disconnected mentally from the mind-muscle component and they're more like mind-position focused, this is going to lead to when their technique breaks down, it often breaks down more before they notice it, before they're mentally aware of it. And that leads to bigger injuries. So a bodybuilder or an aesthetic athlete might just have a small tweak in a muscle when they get injured. Whereas a powerlifter or a strength athlete, they might have a complete tear, a rupture. So the injuries for strength athletes tend to be bigger. Whereas for aesthetic athletes, they tend to be smaller. And that's in part due to the difference in training focus. Again, aesthetic athletes are tempo-based and mind-muscle connection-based. Whereas strength athletes are explosive and they're mind-movement-based. Now, for strength athletes, when performing max effort lifts, they do need to push to the edge of failure more than aesthetic athletes because that's how they're going to push where their boundaries are. That's how they're going to make proper increases in strength. Now, the challenge for strength athletes is they should only push to the edge of failure. This is going to sound funny, but based on how they fail. Their technique proficiency is the limiter. They shouldn't perform any reps that look like crap. They should perform reps until they believe the next one is going to look like crap. That means they're pushing to the edge of failure. They're going to failure, not into failure. Now, for a lot of beginner athletes, their lifts look like crap, even at like light weights. They're going to have variances. They're going to be a little on their toes on this squat. The next squat, maybe they're back in their heels. The following squat, their knees go inward. The next squat, everything looks perfect. So out of a set of 4, the first 3 look like crap and the last one was finally right. You would say, well, are we not supposed to progress in weight load? Argumentatively, no. If they can't move that correctly, how the hell is putting anything heavier on them going to help? So it is better to move correctly first, then move heavier things. Even if that means you're stuck squatting 135 for 10 workouts just to figure out what the hell you're supposed to be look like. Yes. I have had so many clients over the years where they'll come to me and they're like, oh, I want to get stronger. And then I see their lifts and I'm like, oh my God, these look horrible. So you just tried a 275 squat. That looked hideous. Let's drop you back down. All of a sudden at 185, technique starts to break down. So then we just stay at 185. Then we go 195, then 205, then 215, then 225. And then maybe it takes them, 3, 4, 5, 6 months to get back to 275. But when they're back there, everything looks perfect. They have no, lower back tightness. Their knee isn't hurting. Their shoulder doesn't hurt. Like they're moving it so crisp and efficient. And then all of a sudden in another 3 to 6 months, they're at 315, then 355, then 375, then 405. And boom, this rocket launch of progression starts. But it only started by us going back, going down in weight, moving things perfectly, and then moving up. So should you train to failure? Yes. But that is specifically to the edge of it, not into it. This is why clients send me videos all the time. I have clients send me videos of their lifts every single week. I actually go through and give them feedback on every single video every single week. It's a lot of work, but that's why I kept my clients, and that's why I believe the service is super beneficial, is I watch how they move, and then I say, hey, pay attention to this, pay attention to this. So on a squat, I might say, hey, you filmed this. In the way you filmed it, you can see that your heel at the bottom, third of the squat, your heel actually lifts up a little bit. And you can see that the outside edge of the heel actually lifts up, the knee dips in a little bit. So your weight is shifting into your big toes at the very bottom of the squat. This means the weight load is improperly balanced through our external rotators and internal rotators. For simplicity, let's say the glutes and the adductors. We don't have a good balance between our glutes and adductors. And that is then going to cause our lower back to feel overexerted in this lift, and you're going to have lower back pain. So before we go heavier, on the bottom 1/3 of the squat, I want you to maintain pushing your pinky toes into the ground. And they'll say, holy crap, wow, that made a huge difference. I felt much stronger last time out of the bottom, and now all of a sudden my back doesn't hurt. And then we can move forward. So my job as a coach is to watch their videos and say, hey, here's where the technique is breaking down. This is what I want you to watch. This is how I want you to fix it. Go do that before we add weight. That is a huge benefit. So only do we add weight as their technique cleans up and it allows us to do so, basically. So when the lift looks correct, that's when we add weight. If the lift does not look correct, we correct it first, and then we add weight. So people should aim to lift correctly first. Then they can push again a little bit into the edge of failure. Maybe they add a rep, maybe they add 5 pounds. But again, if the technique starts to break down, we stop adding anything. We lift correctly at that weight, and then we add weight again. So lift correctly first, then you can test the edge of failure. So when you're learning technique, that's a great time to leave a few reps in the tank. If you're an aesthetic athlete, the first time you're trying a movement, maybe the first 1 or 2 weeks, leave a few reps in the tank, stay a little safe, figure out what's supposed to be going on. And then as you have the program for subsequent weeks, then you push closer and closer and closer into the edge of failure. For strength-based athletes, you leave a few reps in the tank if they don't look clean, if your technique isn't super crisp yet. The second technique breaks down, stop. Do not continue to perform additional weight. Don't try to make bigger progressions. Fix that first. Absolutely, 100%. You should lift correctly first, then add weight. The small pushes, the pushing into like closer into the edge of failure, is how you're going to make progressions. But you want to do it safely. So, the debate of training to failure versus leaving a few reps in the tank. You leave a few reps in the tank when movements are new and when you can't get the technique or you're uncertain if the technique is correct yet. As the movements become more familiar, as your technique becomes more solidified, then we do push to failure. But again, the definitional difference here is we train to the edge of failure, not train into failure. So when we say train to failure, unfortunately, that's actually too vague of a phrase. Train to failure should be said, train to the edge of failure. We do not want to train into failure, but we do want to train to the edge of failure. Okay. Hopefully that was helpful. If you have any follow-up questions, shoot me an email at brutalirongym@gmail.com. You can also check out our website for all the services we offer and other beneficial resources. And that website is www.brutalirongym.com. If you like the podcast, please share the podcast. The more we share it, the more people the podcast can help. Sharing it on social media is huge. That reaches the most amount of people. So if you don't mind, take a clip from our Instagram or make a little post with a screenshot image of the podcast you're listening to. Just share it a little bit. If you don't mind, I really would appreciate it because it helps the podcast reach more people than what I can just do on my platforms alone. So please, if you find a podcast or listen to one that you're like, man, that was really good, please share it so we can increase the exposure for other people. And then if you like the podcast, you can donate to support the podcast on our website, or you can get your supplements from NutriCost.com. That's where I buy mine. You can use the code BrutalIron10 for a 10% discount. You get a 10% discount, and we actually get a 10% commission. Now, commission does not raise the price that you pay, but it does help support the podcast for long term and hosting costs and all that stuff. So that's a great way to support the podcast if you'd like to do so. If you like the information we share in the podcast, you can find more from us on our social media channels. You can find us and follow us on Instagram and YouTube under the name Brutal Iron Gym. As always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening.